We probably had a perfect scene setter this morning. We heard in the morning from Claudio that even in net zero, you need oil and gas. We heard from Claire beforehand and her panel talking about all those end uses that still very difficult to decarbonize and will still require oil and gas. And we heard from Will about the financing on the way to net zero. We're joined by, not to big you up too much, probably a celebrity in the oil and gas world. If anybody is an oil wonk like me, they know who Andy is. Before Kosmos, a career at Petrofac, the services provider, BP, you've got exposure to Russia, the Caspian, the Gulf Coast, and now, crucially, Africa. And that's where we're here to talk about. I want to open by talking about an event in 6 weeks' time in Abu Dhabi, COP28. You work on the ground in Africa and you work with governments very closely. What is the conversation like when we're talking about the net zero world, getting there, when these countries also face higher costs of energy, booming populations, energy insecurity, and really they're running just to stay still in terms of the energy story?
Yeah, no, a great pleasure to be here. And I think it's an interesting perspective we bring. We're a US-listed company, so we're raising equity, we're raising debt, bank financing in the US and in Europe. And when you look at the energy transition, it's a very different conversation between the developed world and the undeveloped world. You know, we're balancing affordability, security, and climate. And, you know, when you look at the developed world, clearly, you know, particularly in our financing conversations, you know, climate is first and foremost, but equally now we're into a conversation, and rightly so, around security. When you move to a conversation, let's say in Dakar, when I'm talking to the president of Senegal, he starts with access to power and affordability and energy poverty. 600 million Africans don't have access to power today, twice the population of the United States. And so that's first and foremost on his mind. But it doesn't mean to say he's not on a journey to net zero. He's absolutely on that. And in fact, you know, I think a little known fact is 30% of the installed generating capacity in Senegal, 30% is renewable. So he's made a long way down the path. The question then for us is around how do you solve that? Because, you know, the developed world is starting from a different place from the undeveloped world, and therefore they're going to put priorities on different issues. And I think bringing those two things together is the challenge now, and ultimately I believe it's soluble, but it's a much more complicated problem than I think, you know, a simple description around climate, security, and affordability. We've got a very different starting point in Africa, and they will start from access to power as fundamentally underpins the social development of their countries.
Yeah. I think over the last 2 years, we've had a bit of obviously an energy crisis. It's very well covered. And the attitude, particularly in places like Europe, has changed towards or less against fossil fuels or keeping energy in the ground, so to speak. To quote the famous song, you know, go away, come back, why can't I just have it both ways? UK, Norway, we're seeing new oil production coming online or being licensed. Germany's using more and more coal. If you think about Kosmos's projects now in Africa, what makes your business case so valuable? If it's more clean, is it more secure? Is it in a better geolocation than others?
So Kosmos is transitioning from an oil-weighted portfolio to a gas-weighted portfolio. We made a large discovery, actually the largest non-associated gas discovery offshore Africa in Mauritania and Senegal. We have the first phase of the monetization of that, which is an LNG project called Greater Tortue Ahmeyim, GTA in short, which is coming on stream in the first quarter of next year. It's a new source of LNG for Europe. And I think it's important that Europe actually has a well-diversified source of supply. You know, it's great to see US LNG growing, Qatar LNG growing. They will become the dominant players. So if you like Europe's move from a single source of supply in Russia to two, and events happen, and actually having a more diverse supply is fundamental. But what's unique, if you like, about Mauritania and Senegal as a new source of LNG is that it's an advantaged gas. Not all gas is equal. Some gas has CO2 in it, which has to be removed and then re-injected. So it's got no CO2. It's the closest source of gas to Europe. Therefore, the transition costs, the transportation costs, and the amount of energy burnt, as it were, to deliver the gas is lowest. And when you compare it to US onshore, it's about 40% less carbon intensive, about 25% less carbon intensive than Qatar. The 40% versus US is because there's no flaring. So it's interesting. So as Europe actually sort of looks at Senegal and Mauritania as a new source of supply, one of the strong marketing aspects of the gas is that it's actually a cleaner source of gas today, one of the cleanest. So it's a new source. You're diversifying. There's growth in the projects, and it's differentiated by its carbon footprint. So we're pleased, as it were, to be enabling a new dialogue to occur between European buyers that need that, and actually West African countries that want to be connected with Europe.
Yeah, and when building these projects or assessing these projects, the sort of energy crisis is still relatively new, right? Post these projects being developed or being invested in, do you anticipate this will be long-term offtake agreements with European buyers into the spot market, a bit of both?
Yeah, it's what's quite interesting is that traditional way of doing things is long-term offtake. Why? Actually, it's the only way to get finance. We're straight into that financing conversation and so the first phase is a 10-year contract, actually. So it enabled us to get access to financing. I think when we've got the first phase is 2.5 million tons. The second phase will be of equivalent size. I think there's much more optionality there to change the contract structure, because you've got the cash flows in phase one to be, secure the financing for phase two. So sort of taking an incremental approach, actually doing it in phases, actually supports the financing. But it does leave you then the optionality of how you structure the contracts. So I think the world is changing. There's much more spot LNG around.
Yeah.
And clearly, I see a more volatile world, actually. So the ability to take advantage of that, but have a sort of a fixed core of offtake that's probably more longer term and fixed price would be the right balance.
When roughly are you at full production, you think?
So, well, when we start up the beginning of next year, and then we ramp up through 24. That's phase one, and then phase two was sort of around the end of the decade.
Okay, so not just in time, but almost just in time, I suppose.
Yeah, and like everyone, has got a different view of when the market is going to transition. But I think that one thing that is characteristic of LNG is the lead time is significant. And actually, GTA will be the fastest greenfield project from discovery to first gas, and it's around 9 years. For people in the room, that sounds a heck of a long time, but if you look through the history of the industry, it's had lengthy timelines associated with projects. What happens with the next phase is, because you're building off the existing infrastructure, they're brownfield and they can move a little faster. But that's one of the conundrums at the moment, is building out supply. It's not instantaneous, and therefore these mega projects do require actually lengthy timelines.
Yeah, I guess, and the demand profile also looks less certain the further you go out, right? So getting these agreements help. Working with a commodity-rich nation, it doesn't always mean that the government or the people of that country get the riches of all of this gas, or all of the coal, or all of the minerals, or all of whatever the commodity is, sort of the commodity curse that we've heard of before. And we've seen it many times over. When you're working with governments, particularly in Africa and in developing markets, how do you manage their expectations? I know there's different risk profiles if you're going in first and there's nothing been discovered, for example, versus if you're building out a second or a third field and in a new licensing agreement. But But how do you make sure or aim to have those revenues generated go towards empowering this equitable or this just transition? And then, as an American company working in Africa, raising debt or raising equity in Europe, the transparency levels for you would be very different versus if you were just a locally based African company. How do you navigate those things? Lots of questions there for you.
Yeah, no, but look, it's interesting. As you said, I've heard, this is my fifth decade in the industry. So I go back to where I started when I was a kid, and I actually spent a lot of time in Alaska. That's where my wife is from and her family are from. It's an incredible state. It's the only state that has actually a negative state tax. So there's a permanent fund put in place that was there to create, the benefits from Prudhoe Bay to ensure that they were reinvested. So they actually have a positive, rebate from that every year. So, there are great mechanisms where the industry has set up permanent funds, sovereign funds to sort of deal with that issue. Governance, you start with governance first. So, mechanism is sovereign wealth funds. Obviously, Norway's a great example of that. You mentioned I worked in Azerbaijan, with BP, did a lot of work to create a sovereign fund there. One of the things that we've done, and it's easier when you're starting with a country that doesn't actually have an existing industry. So in Senegal, when we made the discovery that no existing production, essentially the same in Mauritania. They'd had one small field. But, there's legislation being put in place to create a sovereign wealth fund to enable those revenues to be used for future generations. So I'm pleased that we're starting from the right place in both countries. So all the lessons learned from the past are being incorporated. The second element to it is around transparency, which we're big advocates for. I think we're still the only US listed company. Probably someone will prove me wrong, but we publish all of our contracts, on the web. So all of our oil and gas contracts are published and therefore transparent. It's something that we did from day one. These are fundamentally a contract between ourselves and the country and the people, and therefore I genuinely believe that they have an absolute right to see those contracts, and therefore we believe that we've started from a very strong position there. We're a big advocate for EITI. Mauritania and Senegal are both members. In fact, Senegal hosted their annual conference of the EITI in Dakar. So you can put all of those elements together, and I think you can say that the governance frame is a lot stronger, as it were, today for two countries that are starting their oil and gas journey than some of the things that you referred to. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to believe that when we bring a sort of, it is a US view to governance, that we can be a force for good and therefore create the right starting point. The second thing that's really important then is mutuality with the country. And, fundamentally, if I talk about Senegal at the moment, we're embarking on a project in Yakateranga where we are fundamentally there to create a low-cost, sustainable source of gas that can be used in power generation and then hopefully used more for a larger industrial use. But you're enabling social development. Mm-hmm. And if you are doing it through that mechanism, ultimately the country will benefit from having a secure, low-cost source of power. And the combination of those two things, I think, that goes a long way to negating some of the things you talked about, which was ultimately, it's oil, if you like, and you go back to the oil curse, it was just simply an export, revenue stream, and actually, therefore, how did it get reinvested? Yeah. So I think, gas in that sense is different. We know if we have an LNG scheme, there will be a domestic element to it, and the combination of the two will enable the countries to prosper. So I'm actually quite positive about it. Yeah. But it's something that we believe is phenomenally important in our role. That we need to lead on this and not actually sort of just be there to apply rules.
Mm-hmm. And export it and bring the revenues home. In the last couple of years, we've seen really good oil prices, really good gas prices. If you're an oil and gas major, it's been a fantastic couple of quarters. We have seen a few targets or ambitions being maybe not moved back on, but watered down slightly or less maybe ambitious in terms of their reduction in production, for example. In the financing world, though, it's gone almost the opposite way. We've seen banks do Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, the NZBA, whatever acronyms you want to throw them out there. There's definitely a banking alliance set up around them. So that's moving one direction, almost the opposite to the oil and gas space. That means a lot for financing. Some are saying won't fund fossil fuels. Some are saying I'll fund some types, but not all types. And the question mark really still is what type is being financed. You mentioned earlier having a offtake agreement obviously helps with the financing. But beyond that, are you seeing anything in the projects that you're looking at that are making it more expensive or more difficult to get financing? And does it change maybe by geography? Are the Europeans less willing to lend to these kind of projects anymore versus the Americans?
Yeah, look, it'd be false to say that it hasn't got harder and hasn't got more expensive. But in a way, the challenge is good because I believe the best projects can actually get access to finance. So what do I mean by a quality project? There has to be an underlying quality resource, So I think, advantage gas in our world, low CO2, low cost, ultimately allows you to create a different conversation with financing. I think innovative development schemes where you're lowering the front-end entry cost and maybe more of a phased approach, not the big mega projects, that had a massive, particularly in LNG, a massive front-end capital. Those things very difficult to do today, So you've got to be more innovative about the concept. And then I think the third element is crucially important, as we've talked about, creating the mutuality with the country and actually, therefore, the economic development that occurs as a result of the project. There is inward investment going on, and it isn't simply about an export scheme. So, it's tougher, but actually, I think we still are having healthy conversations with financing and believe that we can actually get the financing we need to move forward. But you have to differentiate the project in a way where it's a quality project in a sense that can be defended. And I think we've got a portfolio that supports that.
But do you think there's a difference between the different regions in terms of willingness to finance? We track all of these numbers, and America seems pretty content to finance a lot of fossil fuels. Europe, as an importer, naturally doesn't, right?
Yeah, and I think that's it's certainly a little harder in Europe, right? But I think there's a different conversation where people are looking at energy security and actually trying to find the projects that can enable, greater security, but with the right, sort of carbon credentials.
Yeah, we're hearing a lot about new technologies, new markets, green molecules, blue molecules, electrons, etc. We've got a minute left, so I'll ask you this question and we'll answer quick because Dana gets a bit vicious on time.
All right.
You've moved kind of from oil towards an LNG-orientated company at Kosmos. Is there a new market you're eyeing up and thinking that is one where I can imagine us getting into in future, or are you still focusing on this advantage gas for now? It seems to be...
Yeah, look, the company's evolved a lot. We were originally a frontier explorer, opening up big oil basins. We opened up Ghana. We actually, opened up a great gas basin in Mauritania and Senegal. And that's enabled us now to sort of twin track. We're about low cost, low carbon oil. The world needs that today. And actually short cycle oil that is, that's got the right carbon credentials is an important part of the energy mix today. So that's sort of infrastructure-led exploration we do in the Gulf of Mexico, where we're doing in Equatorial Guinea. We just announced actually a discovery today in the Gulf of Mexico. A little known fact is Gulf of Mexico barrels are some of the most advantaged in the world. 10 kilograms per barrel carbon intensity, other than Norway and some of the Middle East fields, pretty good. So we're going to continue to do that. And then ultimately, the long-dated investment in the company is going to be around long-legged advantage gas, where we can get the right mix of domestic and LNG. So we're not going to deviate from a strategy that we set out in 2020 that I think is actually what the world needs today. We're serving our customers in Africa, and we're doing it in a way where I think we're an important part of the energy mix. And we're doing what we know we're good at. And I believe, there is a need for companies with the right credentials and the right strategy to enable Africa to grow its economy, and fundamentally, it needs the right thinking to do that.
And in a transparent way.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're over time. Dana's about to take us off. If everybody could join me in a round of applause for Andy. Really appreciate you joining us today.
I appreciate it. I enjoyed it. Great. Thank you.